The quiet town of Tikhozyorsk kept its secrets well. That is, until the strange and sudden disappearance of Anton Samoylov, a young doctor and respected resident, brought unease to everyone. His sister Dasha, the only close family he had, returned from the capital to search for him, knowing no one understood Anton quite like she did. But the deeper she delved, the clearer it became that her brother's vanishing was tied to something dark and sinister. Returning to her brother's old house, Dasha found a strange note scrawled in hurried handwriting on his desk. "Don't trust the shadows. Only look into the dark mirrors." She had no idea what it could mean, but it was not the only odd thing she noticed. In the house, empty for several days, she felt a vague, eerie presence, as if something or someone was watching her. That evening, she met a local detective named Viktor Gromov, one of the few people genuinely interested in finding Anton. Viktor was reserved and brooding, but also deeply perceptive. He shared that he'd been tracking a secret local group known as the Keepers of Shadows. This group believed there was a thin boundary between this world and the otherworldly, one that, in special places, allowed the living to encounter those who had passed. Viktor admitted that he'd faced threats himself when he'd tried to get closer to the Keepers. He believed they were involved in Anton's disappearance and claimed that the Keepers recruited those they considered worthy of becoming guardians of the shadows. The next day, Dasha was joined by her brother's old friend, Kirill, an artist and passionate researcher of local folklore. Kirill shared the legend of an abandoned chapel at the town's edge, rumored to be built atop an ancient burial mound. People had avoided it for generations, as it was said to harbor a spirit that lured people in by playing on their deepest fears. Kirill brought his notebook filled with sketches of the chapel and descriptions of symbols he'd seen during his expeditions. On one of the pages, he'd drawn symbols identical to those on the walls of Anton's house. Dasha, Viktor, and Kirill all wrestled with the question, how was her missing brother connected to this ancient curse? Kirill saw these symbols not just as markings, but as ancient warnings meant to keep dark forces at bay. Dasha and Viktor weren't fully convinced by his theories, but they decided to study them in the hope that they might reveal a way forward in the search. Meanwhile, Dasha began to notice strange sensations whenever she looked into a mirror, feeling a faint dizziness. It was as though something moved in the reflection, yet when she looked closely, she saw only her own frightened face. Soon, the group discovered that the Keepers of Shadows indeed held clandestine meetings, performing their rituals on nights with a full moon. At these gatherings, they left black mirrors in the forest, mirrors through which they claimed one could see the Keeper, a spirit said to watch over each resident of Tikhozyorsk. Their investigation brought another ally, Liza, a local journalist who had spent years investigating mysterious disappearances in the town and was compiling articles on the subject. She told Dasha that every house connected to these strange vanishings contained ancient amulets or symbols similar to those she'd found in archived reports. Liza wasn't just looking for a story. She wanted answers, especially since she, too, had begun to feel that the shadows were creeping closer. Finally, with enough evidence in hand, they made their way to the chapel. Staying overnight, each of them felt a distinct presence. As midnight approached, strange events began to unfold. Mirrors inside the chapel reflected not their faces, but shadowy figures eerily resembling themselves, as if from another world. Dasha saw her brother in one of the mirrors. He reached for her, his face twisted with desperation, and she could hear his whisper, "Save me, but don't look the shadows in the eyes, or you'll stay here forever." Viktor suddenly recalled an old legend about a guardian who had to make a sacrifice to free a soul trapped in the world of shadows. But to do so, one of them would have to remain in the chapel, forever bound to its darkness. They found themselves at a crossroads. Liza suggested leaving the mirror with Anton's image in the chapel and performing a ritual to break the bond with his soul. Kirill insisted that no one should remain behind, fearing that such a decision would only feed the shadow's endless hunger for souls. Viktor, however, was ready to offer himself. saying that he had long sensed death's approach and was willing to accept his fate if it meant freeing Anton. Dasha was paralyzed by the thought of leaving her brother, but how could she abandon her friends? Desperate, she decided to act on her own. Without consulting the others, she began a mirror ritual, lighting candles and murmuring the incantations she had read in Anton's journal. The mirrors began to tremble, darkened, and in that moment Dasha saw Anton's face appear before her, yet shadows loomed behind him, reaching for her as well. At dawn, Dasha awoke alone in the chapel, surrounded by shattered fragments of the mirrors. Her friends were nowhere to be found. Only their shadows remained on the ground, frozen like faint imprints, and she could hear faint whispers along the walls saying, "The sacrifice is complete." Dasha stumbled out of the chapel, not knowing what had happened to her friends or to Anton. Yet from that moment, whenever she looked in a mirror, she saw a familiar shadow standing just behind her. Back in town, she kept quiet about what happened in the chapel, but sometimes, in the stillness of night, she could hear their voices, calling her back to the dark world of the shadows.